Story is to religion as math is to science. So, true story. Our friend and neighbor Dave is a former high-level, you might say, hockey player, ice hockey player. I understand that some ice hockey is even played in Florida. He bears the stigmata of his former vocation every time he smiles. His 4 upper teeth are missing. Dave is big, and he's bluff, he's rough, and he's tough on the outside. On the inside, he is a teddy bear, particularly when it comes to those who are in need, his family, his cats, and his garden. For a guy who's taller than I am, considerably bigger than I am, to watch him tenderly plant his garden each spring is a delight. It is a great pride and joy for Dave. And I take pleasure myself in walking by it between our house and the university. One day, when I was walking down the street past Dave's house, I noticed something different, however. Dave was, as so often, in his front garden, but in 2 of the garden beds were 2 young women who were clearly weeding his garden. So I paused and said to him, Dave, what's with the young women? And Dave responded to me by saying, "They're weeding my garden." I realized that I had perhaps not been clear enough in my question, so I rephrased it and said, I can see that they're weeding your garden, Dave, but who are they and why are they weeding your garden? He said, "Oh, well, they're Jehovah's Witnesses." At this point, the 2 young women looked up, smiled broadly, and waved, and I waved back. I said, "All right, why are 2 Jehovah's Witnesses weeding your garden, Dave?" And Dave, a Roman Catholic of perhaps some lapsed standing, said, "Well, they came up to my door and they said they wanted to talk to me about Jesus. I said they could talk to me about Jesus all day if they weeded my garden." Now, you may consider this a somewhat lighthearted, even frivolous example of interfaith dialogue. Dave, the big former hockey player, Roman Catholic, and 2 very petite young women who are Jehovah's Witnesses. But to me, there is something profound, almost parabolic in this particular instance, particularly when every 6 weeks I receive an email from my acquaintance, no more than acquaintance, friend and colleague, Jonathan Lopez in New York City on the situation of Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia and previously in the former Soviet Union. It is very clear that any of these young ladies' co-religionists would gladly trade their place in Russia for a moment or 2 in Dave's garden. It's a new thing to see that kind of hospitality. And in fact, I would want to present to you this afternoon the idea that in fact interfaith dialogue in myriad forms is a new thing under the sun, contrary even to the wisdom of the great Solomon. In 1984, the Roman Catholic theologian Hans Kung was interviewed on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation by the late Peter Zosky, sometimes referred to as the cartographer of the Canadian soul. And Zosky asked Dr. Kung what he thought posterity would think of the 20th century. And Dr. Kung observed that he was convinced that those who succeed us in life would look back at the 20th century not so much as a time of war and of Shoah, of Gulag, but rather as that moment in history when the world's great faiths first began to talk to one another. That, this conference has demonstrated yet again, is critical. For as Dr. Kung said that same year in Riva del Garda, there will be no peace without peace among religions. There will be no peace among religions without dialogue among religions. And that dialogue often proceeds in the most unexpected way. 3 other quick stories to illustrate the point. Canada does not normally consider itself a particularly martial nation. That doesn't mean the Canadians have not served with vigor and courage in arenas of conflict. The Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, for example, the kilt-wearing, bagpipe-playing troopers from the center of the country, were christened the Ladies from Hell by opposition forces between 1914 to 1918. But our concern primarily is not so much combat, but rather peacekeeping. Since 1956, when then Ambassador to the United Nations and Secretary of State, or the equivalent, Secretary of State Lester B. Pearson, invented the modern concept of peacekeeping, Canadian military doctrine is underlied by the premise that there are no military solutions. The only point of engaging the military in international operations is to enforce a timeout so that the diplomats can get back to the table. In the 1990s, in the aftermath of the deconstruction of the former Yugoslavia, a new strategy was developed by the Chaplain General's Corps of the Canadian Armed Forces. Amongst them, my colleague, then Captain Stephen Moore, a great disciple of Miroslav Volf, pioneered the idea of Canadian chaplains drawing together local religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian, sitting them down and, to paraphrase Eldridge Cleaver, saying to them, "Do you wish to be part of the problem or part of the solution? Because you have the influence to be either. Choose." But to make a long story short, this has become standard procedure for the Canadian military in peacekeeping and even in combat operations, to draw together local religious factions and work with them to begin a process of dialogue. In Afghanistan, this went so far as to involve Captain Mohammed, a Canadian chaplain, serving 2 terms, the second completely voluntary, in order to continue the process. Those of you amongst us who are of my vintage will recall the daily body counts during the later years of the Vietnam conflict. It's always easy to count the bodies. It is not so easy to count those who continue to live and breathe because someone has engaged in this kind of dialogue, even in a theater of conflict. Story the next. I think everyone here is familiar enough with the circumstances of the Baha'i community in Iran that you do not need me to rehearse the rather sorry history of nearly 2 centuries of persecution in the context of that nation. But something new under the sun occurred in 2014. The Ayatollah Abdul Hamid Massoumi Tehrani, moved, it seems in part, by the tragedy of 9/11 in New York, offered what can only be construed as a policy to the Iranian Baha'i community for the actions of the Iranian government of which he himself was a senior member. He went so far, in fact, as to present the Baha'i community in Tehran with a work of calligraphy capturing one of Baha'u'llah's great statements. It was an extraordinary gesture. The Baha'i were quite moved, but they did not want to put Massoumi Tehrani at any form of risk within the context of Iran, and therefore around the world, Baha'i leaders contacted those of their acquaintances and friends who they believed would be appreciative of and supportive of the action of the Ayatollah, and they asked us not to write to the Ayatollah Massoumi Tehrani himself, but rather to write to leaders of the Baha'i in Canada, for example, or the United Kingdom, or Latin America, and to express their appreciation obliquely, and there would be mechanisms to extend that appreciation to the Ayatollah. I was one of those who was asked to write, and to be candid, I didn't think too highly of what I was doing. Of course, I was appreciative, but I knocked off a fairly swift letter on the 400th anniversary of the death of William Shakespeare, and quoted the bard, or paraphrased rather, noting in the letter my appreciation for the Ayatollah's action and observing that there is a tide in the affairs of humanity which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune, suggesting that the fortune would be the emergence of religious liberty in the context of Iran. On August the 3rd in 2014, the Ayatollah Abdul Hamid Masumi Tehrani sent me a 4-page, single-space letter translated from the Farsi, in which he extolled the vision, the virtues, and the hope of a world in which religious liberty would prevail. I read you just a few sentences. It is with my belief in the inherent dignity of human beings, regardless of their creed, school of thought, or religion, along with my gratitude and appreciation for your generous support of my recent gesture of sympathy for Baha'is, that I wish to invite you to assist in bringing about a comprehensive, committed, and uncompromising movement against discrimination and religious and ideological apartheid. Story the third. People generally think of Canada, it seems, as we travel abroad, as an almost ideal country. After all, Canadians are appallingly nice, polite. I step on your foot and I apologize. You step on my foot and I apologize. Peter C. Newman, a Canadian journalist and writer of some distinction, told me one evening that the definition of a Canadian is a person who enters a room and takes the least comfortable chair. But Canada is not, by any means, a utopia, not even a proto-utopia. Oh, we make a good effort to be a laboratory for what a plural, just, and religiously free world might look like. But in fact, we have our issues. They're dark issues, and they are issues of racism towards the indigenous people of the country. Without going into great detail, for over a century, the establishment of residential schools for indigenous children torn from their parents and punished brutally, very often abused physically and sexually, underwent one of Raphael Lemkin's 2 definitions of genocide. The first, of course, is the obvious, the physical slaughter of the Shoah. The second is the destruction of a culture and a peoplehood. It has been a difficult process to even begin to discuss reconciliation with that kind of history, and yet it has begun with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, modeled after that of post-apartheid South Africa. It has also begun in terms of the manner in which Canadians in general are beginning to wake up to a great richness in society that has been overlooked and denied, that of not only Indigenous culture, but Indigenous spirituality. And yet, just recently, in the city of Winnipeg, in the very center of Canada, and in fact, the very center of the continent of North America, an extraordinary thing occurred. The 200th anniversary of what is now called the Peguis-Selkirk Treaty was marked. The Peguis-Selkirk Treaty preceded all other treaties in the Canadian context, and it was based on a mutual understanding of the land as Mother Earth on the part of the Scots refugees Lord Selkirk transplanted to the plains of Canada, and Chief Peguis and 4 colleagues who recognized that there was a spiritual bond between and amongst people that must, in fact, be acknowledged and recognized regardless of the religious construct that those people might hold dear. When it came time to mark the 200th anniversary of this incredible and largely unknown document, Chief Jim Bear of the Broken Head Nation wrote to the current Lord Selkirk, James Douglas, in the House of Lords in the United Kingdom, and said, "Would you come back to mark this particular event?" And John Perrin, the president of the Scottish Heritage Society of the province of Manitoba, wrote equally to Lord Selkirk. He gave it some thought, wrote back and said, "I'll come if you work together." And so they did, and we did. And it was an extraordinary manifestation, a kind of back to the future moment in which the spirituality of the Cree people and the Lakota people of Manitoba 200 years ago reconnected through an interreligious and interfaith dialogue with the Scots Presbyterians who came here after the English decided to steal their land for sheep. Well, I opened with an observation, a couple of observations by Dr. Kung. Let me close similarly. In 1990, Dr. Kung wrote an extraordinary essay with the entitled Spero contra Spem, I Hope Against Hope. He wrote the entire essay in Latin, which I understand is his favorite language in which to write. Go figure. He wrapped up the essay by expressing 3 hopes that those who hold religious liberty dear may well take to heart. He said, "Spero unitatem ecclesiarum, I hope for unity amongst the churches. Spero pacem religionem, I hope for peace among religions. Spero communitatem nationem, I hope for community among the nations." I am beyond measure delighted and privileged to have been able to share these minutes from this podium with you today, and to express my appreciation in turn for all those who have made this time together for us possible, and of course especially to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ganoon Diop. It seems to me that this time together, in fact, is a step towards achieving those hopes of Dr. Kung. And Ganoon, to you and your colleagues, thank you for the privilege of participating in the building of those hopes.